The summer of 1943 baked the suburbs of Richmond, Virginia, into a brittle crust. A patriotic fervor hung in the humid air, thick as the anxiety over the news from the Pacific, but it couldn't make the plants grow. All along the street, Victory Gardens were failing. They were supposed to be the home front's answer to scarcity, a symbol of resilience. Instead, they were monuments to desperation. Tomato plants, scrawny and pale, offered up fruits no bigger than a thumb. Lettuce leaves turned a sickly yellow before they could be harvested. The soil itself, compacted and sterile after decades of urban life, refused to give. The government pamphlets offered encouragement but no solutions because the one thing that might have helped, commercial fertilizer, was gone. The chemical plants that once bagged nitrogen for lawns were now packing it into munitions, feeding the war machine instead of a nation's gardens. The smell wasn't of fresh earth and growing things. It was the scent of dust and quiet failure. For Dorothy Harris, that failure was personal. At 34, with her husband fighting somewhere in the Pacific, the responsibility for their 2 young children rested squarely on her shoulders. Every morning she looked out at her small backyard plot, a mirror of every other yard on her block, and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. The ration book on her kitchen counter was a constant reminder of how little there was, how much was out of her control. Meat, sugar, canned goods, all were precious commodities. This garden was meant to be her buffer against the coming winter, a way to ensure her children had full plates and strong bodies. But as the precious weeks of the growing season slipped away, she saw only weakness. The official methods, the ones everyone followed, were useless against the dead earth. She was doing everything right, and it was all going wrong. Hunger was no longer a distant threat on the radio. It was a real possibility she could see in the wilting leaves outside her window. What Dorothy didn't know yet was that the solution to her problem wouldn't be found in any government guide or gardening magazine. It was a piece of knowledge so simple and powerful that it could turn the most depleted soil into an oasis of abundance, a technique that required nothing more than a shovel and the scraps from her own kitchen. She was about to discover a method that would not only save her family, but would later be systematically buried by the very industries that promised progress after the war. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, a form of self-sufficiency that was a direct threat to corporate profits. On this channel, we unearth the survival knowledge they tried to make you forget. Subscribe so you are prepared when the systems you rely on inevitably fail. Before Dorothy could find this revolutionary answer, however, she first had to confront the terrifying reality of just how close to the edge her family truly was. The year 1943 was a time of calculated sacrifice. On the American home front, patriotism was a currency spent daily, measured in ration stamps and salvaged scrap metal. The government's call for Victory Gardens was more than a suggestion, it was a strategic command. Posters depicted robust families harvesting mountains of produce, a promise of self-sufficiency that would free up commercial food supplies for the troops overseas. But this propaganda hid a devastating irony. The very chemical plants that had once produced the nitrogen fertilizers needed to enrich poor soil were now churning out nitrates for explosives. The industrial might that could have fed the nation was instead fueling the war machine. For millions of women like Dorothy Harris, left to manage households in depleted urban landscapes, this meant they were being sent into a battle for food security without the one weapon that had always guaranteed a victory against barren ground. They were given a mission, but stripped of the tools to complete it. Everywhere Dorothy looked, the official methods were failing. The government pamphlets, filled with cheerful illustrations and simple instructions, were proving to be useless relics from a time of plenty. Her neighbors followed them religiously, tilling the compacted clay, planting in neat rows, and watering with military precision. Yet, their reward was a slow, agonizing defeat. The soil, starved of nutrients for decades, offered nothing in return. It was a sterile medium, incapable of supporting life. You could see the desperation in the pale green of their string bean vines and the way their lettuce leaves turned a sickly yellow before they ever formed a head. The air, which should have been alive with the buzz of pollinators and the scent of growing things, was still and smelled only of dust. They were all doing exactly what they were told, and for their obedience, they were being rewarded with the prospect of hunger. For Dorothy, this collective failure was an intensely personal threat. The ration book on her kitchen table was a brutal ledger of what she could not provide. With her husband thousands of miles away in the Pacific, the health and survival of their 2 young children rested solely on her shoulders. She looked at their small faces and saw the coming winter not in terms of months, but in potential illnesses a poor diet could invite. A meager harvest meant more than just bland meals. It meant a weakened immune system, a greater vulnerability to the seasonal sicknesses that could sweep through a community. The clock was ticking. Every sun-drenched afternoon that passed without growth was another day closer to the first frost, another day closer to a winter where her only defense would be a ration system that was already stretched to its breaking point. She had weeks, perhaps a month at most, to turn this dead patch of earth into a source of life. Failure was not an option. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. Her youngest child, running a slight fever, had refused to eat the watery soup she'd prepared. As Dorothy looked at the sparse contents of her pantry, a cold wave of panic washed over her. It was a tangible, physical sensation of dread. This was it. This was the edge. She could follow the rules and watch her family slowly weaken, or she could find another way. The government's advice was failing an entire nation of gardeners, and waiting for a different outcome was a form of madness. She realized with chilling clarity that the solution would not be found in any official manual or patriotic poster. The knowledge she needed had to come from somewhere else, from a time before neatly packaged fertilizers and promises of easy abundance. She had to find a secret that the modern world had forgotten. Her family's survival depended on it. The journey to her mother-in-law's farm in rural Kentucky was a retreat into a different world. On the train, Dorothy watched the sterile, manicured suburbs of Richmond give way to rolling hills and untamed greenery. She was running not just from her failing garden, but from the crushing weight of modern solutions that offered no real answers. She expected to find solace, perhaps a few shared rations and words of comfort. She did not expect to find an oasis. Margaret Harris's garden was an explosion of life, a defiant, vibrant rebuttal to the scarcity gripping the nation. The air hummed with bees, heavy with the scent of rich soil and ripe tomatoes. The plants weren't just surviving, they were thriving, their leaves a deep, glossy green, their stalks thick and heavy with produce. While Dorothy's own plot was a testament to failure, this small patch of earth was a miracle of abundance. Her mother-in-law, a woman in her 60s with hands as tough as old leather, simply smiled. The secret wasn't in a bag or a bottle. It was in the earth itself. Margaret didn't lecture. She demonstrated. Leading Dorothy between the rows of flourishing beans, she pointed to the ground. She called it feeding the furrow. The technique was brutally simple, almost insultingly so. First, you dig a trench, about a foot deep, between the rows where you intend to plant. This wasn't for irrigation or drainage. This trench, Margaret explained, was the garden's stomach. Into this deep furrow went everything the kitchen discarded. Potato peels, coffee grounds, eggshells, wilted lettuce, even the leftover scraps from the dinner plates and small chicken bones. There was no complex layering, no precise science of carbon and nitrogen ratios. It was a simple, direct deposit of life back into the soil. You bury the waste, cover it with the excavated earth, and plant your seeds nearby. The soil would do the rest. To Dorothy, accustomed to the clean, almost sterile advice in government pamphlets, the idea felt primitive, dirty, and utterly revolutionary. The true genius of the method, Margaret revealed, was in how it mimicked nature's own cycles, cycles the modern world had tried to replace. The buried scraps decomposed slowly, protected from the sun and air, fostering a rich underground ecosystem of fungi and bacteria. This process released a steady, slow stream of nutrients directly to the plant's root zone, exactly where it was needed most. It wasn't a quick chemical fix. It was a long-term investment in the life of the soil itself. To accelerate the process, Margaret added 2 things Dorothy had in abundance. Ash from the wood stove was sprinkled over the soil, a potent source of potassium. And once a week, she watered the trenches with a mixture that would have horrified her Richmond neighbors: human urine diluted in 10 parts water. It was a sterile, powerful, and entirely free source of nitrogen, the very chemical now being packed into bombs instead of fertilizer bags. Returning to Richmond, Dorothy felt a profound shift inside her. The desperation had been replaced by a fierce, quiet determination. She no longer saw her barren yard as a symbol of her failure, but as a blank canvas. She spent an entire weekend digging, the shovel scraping against the compacted Virginia clay. Her neighbors watched from their windows, their curiosity quickly turning to suspicion. What was she doing, digging those strange ditches in her yard? The first time she carried out the bucket of kitchen scraps and tipped its contents into a trench, their suspicion turned to outright disdain. This wasn't gardening. This was burying garbage. It was unhygienic, un-American. It was something a peasant would do. She ignored their whispers, the way they would pull their children away as she worked. Every peel, every eggshell, every leftover spoonful was a secret investment, a promise she was making to the earth beneath her feet. The criticism soon became more direct. One neighbor, whose own garden was a perfect picture of orderly, pathetic failure, complained that Dorothy's garbage pit would attract rats and disease. The whispers grew louder. They saw her collecting wood ash, saw her carrying watering cans filled with the strange, diluted liquid. They saw her as an eccentric, perhaps even a danger to the neighborhood's propriety. They were following the rules, doing what the government told them, and their reward was clean hands and a meager harvest. Dorothy was breaking every rule, getting her hands dirty with things they considered waste. And for what? To create a foul-smelling mess in her own backyard? For weeks, her garden looked no different from theirs, except for the strange, sunken lines between her rows. She was isolated, the subject of local gossip, a woman clinging to a dirty, old-fashioned hope that seemed destined to fail. Then, after 8 weeks, the earth delivered its verdict. It began subtly. The green of her tomato leaves was a shade deeper than any on the block. Her cabbage heads began to form with a solid, dense authority. Then, the growth became explosive. While her neighbors coaxed thumb-sized, anemic fruits from their spindly vines, Dorothy's plants were heavy with tomatoes 3 times the size, their skins a deep, vibrant red. Her zucchini plants produced with such relentless abundance she could barely keep up with the harvest. The silence of the surrounding yards was broken by the constant, joyful hum of pollinators in her garden, a sound that had been absent all summer. The mockery from over the fences died down, replaced by stunned silence, and then by a quiet, grudging envy. The garbage pit had become the most productive piece of land in the entire neighborhood, a testament to a wisdom that had been dismissed as filth. The following spring of 1944 arrived not with a sense of renewal, but with a weary resignation. The winter had been unusually harsh, and the war news from the Pacific offered little comfort. For the Victory Gardens of Richmond, the previous year's failure was simply a prelude to this year's impossibility. The government promised fertilizers, once a distant hope, were now a forgotten fiction. The soil in her neighbors' yards, having given up its last meager nutrients, was now little more than sterile dust. It was compacted, pale, and cracked under the spring sun, utterly devoid of life. They had followed the rules, tilled the dead earth, and planted their seeds, only to watch them fail to germinate or send up the most pathetic, yellowed sprouts that withered within days. Desperation had curdled into defeat. Most of them simply gave up, leaving their plots as barren monuments to a broken promise. The extreme test wasn't a single storm or a sudden frost. It was a slow, grinding war of attrition against land that had nothing left to give. But in Dorothy Harris's yard, a different story was unfolding. While her neighbors stared at barren clay, she plunged her hands into soil that was dark, moist, and teeming with unseen life. All through the fall and winter, she had continued her ritual, feeding the furrows with every scrap her kitchen produced. The earth had repaid her diligence, transforming from a sterile plot into a living, breathing ecosystem. When she planted her seeds, they didn't just sprout. They erupted from the ground with a vigor that seemed defiant. Her garden was an island of impossible abundance in a sea of suburban despair. She was the first person on her block to harvest, pulling tender lettuce and radishes from the ground weeks before anyone else even had a healthy seedling. The contrast was stark and absolute. On one side of the fence, silence and dust. On her side, the hum of bees, the deep green of healthy leaves, and the quiet, steady work of a system that drew its strength from what others had thrown away. The results were not just visible, they were quantifiable. That year, Her small 30 by 50-foot garden produced nearly 40% of all the vegetables her family consumed. This wasn't just a supplement to their diet, it was a lifeline. It meant she could use her precious ration coupons for milk, butter, and the occasional piece of meat, ensuring her children grew strong and healthy while others struggled with deficiency. The validation came not from an official, but from the very people who had once scorned her. The neighbor who had complained about her garbage pit was the first to appear at her fence, his hat in his hands, humbly asking how she did it. Soon, others followed. The mockery was gone, replaced by a desperate curiosity. Dorothy found herself teaching them, showing them how to dig the trenches, explaining the simple logic of feeding the soil, not just the plant. Her backyard became a classroom, proving that this forgotten knowledge was more powerful than any government pamphlet or chemical fertilizer. This quiet revolution on a single suburban street was a microcosm of a larger, unspoken truth about the war effort. While official propaganda celebrated industrial might and centralized planning, the real resilience of the home front was being built in backyards like Dorothy's. The incredible success of the Victory Garden program, which eventually produced 40% of the nation's fresh vegetables, wasn't due to official guidelines. It was fueled by the rediscovery of these simple, powerful, and decentralized techniques, passed from neighbor to neighbor, mother to daughter. This grassroots knowledge, born of necessity, was what truly fed the nation. It was a potent form of independence, a quiet declaration that true security comes from the earth beneath your feet. But as the war drew to a close, this very independence would make it a target for a new kind of enemy, one that wore a suit and promised progress in a colorful package. When the war finally ended, a wave of relief and a hunger for modernity swept across America. The era of sacrifice was over. The era of convenience had begun. The colossal chemical plants that had produced nitrates for bombs and munitions pivoted with astonishing speed. Their immense industrial capacity, once dedicated to fueling the war machine, was now aimed squarely at the home front. They needed a new market for their nitrogen, and they found it in the very victory gardens that had been saved by older, wiser methods. In brightly colored bags, they sold the promise of a scientific, effortless future. Synthetic fertilizers were marketed not just as a product, but as a symbol of progress, a clean and modern solution that would banish the hard, dirty work of the war years. The message was clear. The future was not in the compost pile, but in a chemical factory. This new, profitable future required the systematic erasure of the past. The self-sufficiency that Dorothy Harris and millions of others had cultivated was a direct threat to the business model of the burgeoning agrochemical industry. Their profits depended on selling a product season after season, not on empowering people to create their own fertility for free. Through aggressive advertising in magazines and on the new medium of television, a new narrative was crafted. Methods like trench composting were actively discredited, framed as old-fashioned, unhygienic, and inefficient. They sold the idea that burying kitchen scraps was a primitive act, something from a less civilized time. This knowledge wasn't forgotten because it failed. It was buried because it worked too well. It wasn't abandoned because it was inferior. It was suppressed because it couldn't be packaged and sold. Sharing this video helps us unearth the skills they deliberately tried to hide from you. But knowledge this fundamental can never be completely destroyed. While the mainstream embraced the convenience of chemical solutions, the old ways survived in the margins. The technique was preserved by small pockets of organic gardeners, by rural families who never abandoned the wisdom of their ancestors, and by those who instinctively distrusted the idea that life could come from a factory. For decades, it was treated as a niche secret, practiced by a counterculture that saw the flaws in the modern industrial system. It wasn't until recent years, with growing concerns about soil degradation, food security, and the chemicals in our environment, that this buried knowledge has begun to resurface. A new generation is now rediscovering that the most powerful solutions are often the simplest, and that true independence grows from the ground beneath our feet. The story of Dorothy Harris is not a relic of the past. It is a blueprint for the future. Look at the world around you, at the supply chains that stretch and break, at food prices that climb with no ceiling in sight. Imagine a prolonged power outage, a sudden economic downturn, or a natural disaster that leaves supermarket shelves bare for weeks. In that moment, there will be two types of people. There will be those who are completely dependent on a system that has just failed them, their security vanishing with the last can on the shelf. And there will be people like you, people who understand that true wealth is not in a bank, but in the soil. They will know how to take the scraps others see as garbage and turn them into life. They won't feel panic. They will feel the quiet confidence that comes from a skill that can never be taken away. This knowledge is the ultimate insurance policy. What you've learned today is more than just a gardening technique. It is an act of reclamation. It is taking back a fundamental piece of human knowledge that was deliberately buried for profit. The powerful industries of the world benefit from your dependence. They want you to believe that you need their products, their systems, their permission to survive. By learning these skills, you are rejecting that narrative. If you believe this knowledge is too important to be forgotten again, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Every subscription is a vote for independence. Every share sends this vital information to someone else who needs it, strengthening our collective resilience against whatever may come. Join us in this mission to unearth the wisdom they tried to make us forget. True security is not something you can buy. It is something you build, one handful of rich, living earth at a time.